September 20th, 1914. My pen is mute, for thought is silent, but my heart aspires to thee, O Lord, uniting thee with our Divine Mother in one love, one veneration. And through thee, the entire being strains towards the ineffable, beyond. Being, beyond the very silence, that is united with that. September 22nd, 1914. O Lord, thou who art on the threshold of the unknowable, I greet thee. And is it not thou greeting thy own self in the unthinkable essence of being, in its immeasurable depths, and even in its most external realizations? For the being is thyself, whatever its mode of existence, and the unthinkable eternal is also thyself in thy essence. And this integral consciousness thou hast made ours, so that we may be thyself, not only in fact but consciously and effectively. And thus all is an interchange of salutations full of love and joyous adoration, in an ardent aspiration of our Mother towards thee and an infinite and powerful response from thee to our Mother, and finally from the totality of thyself to all that is not yet manifested, to all the unknowable which we shall know more and more, better and better, but which will ever remain the unknowable. In the absolute silence all is, now and eternally, in the universal manifestation all will be in a perpetual becoming. In the perfection of consciousness and the integral life, the being sings a canticle of gladness for that which at once is and will be eternally. Hail to thee, Master of the world, art thou not the intermediary between what is and what will be, even while being simultaneously what is and what will be? O marvelous immensity, perceptible and indefinable! At once, in an integral illumination I bow to thee. September 24th, 1914. How present thou art in our midst, beloved Mother! It is as if thou wouldst assure us of thy complete assistance, as if thou wouldst show us that the will which means to manifest through us, has found in us instruments which can realize its law, by placing it in complete accordance with thy present possibilities. The things which seemed most difficult, most improbable, perhaps even most impossible, become wholly realizable, because thy presence is our assurance that the material world itself is prepared to manifest the new form of the will and the law. I greet thee in the joyful plenitude of perfect harmony. Thee, thy principle and thy works. September 25th, 1914. O divine and adorable Mother, with thy help what is there that is impossible? The hour of realizations is near and thou hast assured us of thy aid that we may perform integrally the supreme will. Thou hast accepted us as fit intermediaries between the unthinkable realities and the relativities of the physical world, and thy constant presence in our midst is a token of thy active collaboration. The Lord has willed and thou dost execute, a new light shall break upon the earth. A new world shall be born. And the things that were promised shall be fulfilled. September 28th, 1914. My pen is mute to chant thy presence, O Lord, yet art thou like a king who has taken entire possession of his kingdom. Thou art there, organizing, putting all in place, developing and increasing every province. Thou awakenest those that were asleep. Thou makest active those that were sinking towards inertia, thou art building a harmony out of the whole. A day will come when the harmony shall be achieved and all the country shall be by its very life the bearer of thy word and thy manifestation. But meanwhile my pen is mute to chant thy praise. September 30th, 1914. Lord, thou hast broken down the barriers of thought and the realization has appeared in all its amplitude. Not to forget any of its aspects, to carry out their accomplish. Meant at the same time, without neglecting any of them, not to allow any limitation, any restriction to come in the way and delay our march. This is what thou wilt help us to do through thy supreme intervention. And all those who are thyself, manifesting thee in the perfection of some particular activity, will also be our collaborators, for such is thy will. Our Divine Mother is with us and has promised us identification with the supreme and total consciousness. From the unfathomable depths to the most external world of the senses. And in all these domains Agni assures us of the help of his purifying flame, destroying all obstacles, kindling the energies, stimulating the will, so that the realization may be hastened. Indra is with us for the perfection of the illumination in our knowledge, and the divine Soma has transformed us in his infinite, sovereign, marvelous love, bringer of the supreme beatitude. O divine and sweet Mother, I bow to thee with a rapt, ineffable tenderness, and with infinite trust. O splendid Agni, thou who art so living within me, I call thee, I invoke thee that thou mayst be more living still, that thy brazier may become more immense, thy flames higher and more powerful, that the entire being may now be only an ardent burning, a purifying pyre. O Indra, I venerate and admire thee, I implore thee that thou mayst unite with me, that thou mayst definitively break down all the barriers of thought, that thou mayst bestow upon me the divine knowledge. O thou, sublime love, to whom I gave never any other name, but who art so wholly the very substance of my being, thou whom I feel vibrant and alive in the least of my atoms even as in the infinite universe and beyond, thou who breathest in every breath, movest in the heart of all activities, art radiant through all that is of goodwill and hidden behind all sufferings, thou for whom I cherish a cult without limit which grows ever more intense, permit that I may with more and more reason feel that I am thyself wholly. And thou, O Lord, who art all this made one and much more, O sovereign Master, extreme limit of our thought, who standest for us at the threshold of the unknown, make rise from that unthinkable some new splendor, some possibility of a loftier and more integral realization, that thy work may be accomplished and the universe take one step farther towards the sublime identity, the supreme manifestation. And now my pen falls mute and I adore thee in silence. October 5, 1914. I end the calm silence of thy contemplation, O divine Master, nature is fortified and tempered anew. All principle of individuality is overpast, she is plunged in thy infinity that allows oneness to be realized in all domains without confusion, without disorder. The combined harmony of that which persists, that which progresses and that which eternally is little by little accomplished in an always more complex, more extended and more lofty equilibrium. And this interchange of the three modes of life allows the plenitude of the manifestation. Many seek thee at this hour in anguish and incertitude. May I be their mediator with thee that thy light may illumine them, that thy peace may appease. My being is now only a point of support for thy action and a center for thy consciousness. Where now are the limits, whither have fled the obstacles? Thou art the sovereign Lord of thy kingdom. October 6, 1914. O sweet Mother, thou shouldst teach me to be integrally and constantly thyself, entirely consecrated to the giving of an ever more perfect means of expression to that which wills to manifest. All is calm, serene, there is no more struggle, no more anguish, aspiration itself becomes sovereignly peaceful in its immensity, yet loses nothing of its intensity, and through a curious opposition in the consciousness, like the obverse and reverse sides of a medal, the being perceives at one and the same time, the immutable calm of the infinite reality in which all is forever without any possibility of change, and the ardent and rapid march of all that becomes without cessation in an uninterrupted progression. And to thee, O Lord, both are equally true. October 7, 1914. Let light be poured on all the earth and peace inhabit every heart. Almost all know only the material life heavy, inert, conservative, obscure. Their vital forces are so tied to this physical form of existence that, even when left to themselves and outside the body, they are still solely occupied with these material contingencies that are yet so harassing and painful. Those in whom the mental life is awakened are restless, tormented, agitated, arbitrary, despotic. Caught all together in the whirl of the renewals and transformations of which they dream, they are ready to destroy everything without knowledge of any foundation on which to construct, and with their light made only of blinding flashes they increase yet more the confusion rather than help it to cease. In all there lacks the unchanging peace of thy sovereign contemplation and the calm vision of thy immutable eternity. And with the infinite gratitude of the individual being to whom thou hast accorded this surpassing grace, I implore thee, O Lord, that under cover of the present turmoil, in the very heart of this extreme confusion the miracle may be accomplished and thy law of supreme serenity and pure unchanging light become visible to the perception of all and govern the earth in a humanity at last awakened to thy divine consciousness. O sweet Master, thou hast heard my prayer, thou wilt reply to my call. October 8, 1914. Joy that is contained in activity is compensated and balanced by the perhaps still greater joy contained in withdrawal from all activity, when the two states alter. Nate in the being or are even simultaneously conscious, the felicity is complete, for then, O Lord, thy plenitude is realized. O Divine Master, thou hast granted to me the infinitude of divine contemplation, the perfect calm of thy eternity, and through an identification with our Divine Mother, the All-Realizer, thou hast permitted me to participate in her sovereign power to be conscious and active. In the omnipotent bliss of thy infinitude, I bow to thee. October 10, 1914. May the offering of my being, constantly renewed and growing more and more integral, be laid before the Supreme Reality, the unthinkable who cannot be formulated, but who, in time, expresses himself eternally in an ever completer and more perfect manifestation. O thou whom I cannot name, thou whose will I perceive in supreme silence and total surrender, let me be the representative of all the earth, so that, united with my consciousness, it may give itself unreservedly to thee. Thou art the perfect peace and the marvelous accomplishment, thou art all that the universe is, immutably, beyond time, and wants to be more and more in the consciousness of time and space. Thou art all that is in the infinite stillness and the divine hope of all that wants to be. Lord, dispense to the world thy unbelievable boons. Peace, peace upon all the earth. October 11, 1914. Why this persistent feeling so tinged with uneasiness and expectancy? The being, entirely turned to thee, lives in the beatitude of the divine communion, all is calm, serene, strong, sovereignly peaceful, all is light in widened horizons and, in silent contemplation, my devotion has become intenser yet. What then is this sensation which seems as though grafted upon the being and takes on the appearance of a warning given to a consciousness insufficiently awakened in the domain of matter? I ask why, O Lord, and yet I know that if it is necessary for me to understand the reason, thou hast already told it to me and only my incapacity keeps me from knowing it, or else to know it is neither useful nor even helpful for me, and in this case nothing will reply to my question. But the peace becomes more sovereign still and in an infinite harmony the being takes on its supreme amplitude. O Lord, with what fervor I greet thee. October 12, 1914. It was their sorrow and suffering which the physical being was feeling, Lord. When will ignorance dissolve? When will pain cease? O Lord, grant that each element of the universe may become conscious of its principle of being and, without disappearing, be transformed. May the veils of egoistic blindness which hide thee be removed and mayst thou appear resplendent in the total manifestation. All this is eternally in thy absolute silence, but it is through an infinite progression that it manifests in the integral consciousness. October 14, 1914. Mother Divine, thou art with us, every day thou givest me the assurance and, closely united in an identity that grows more and more total, more and more constant. We turn to the Lord of the universe and to that which is beyond in a great aspiration towards the new light. All the earth is in our arms like a sick child who must be cured and for whom one has a special affection because of his very weakness. Cradled on the immensity of the eternal becomings, ourselves those becomings, we contemplate hushed and glad the eternity of the immobile silence where all is realized in the perfect consciousness and immutable existence, miraculous gate of all the unknown that is beyond. Then is the veil torn, the inexpressible glory uncovered and, suffused with the ineffable splendor, we turn back towards the world to bring it the glad tidings. Lord, thou hast given me the happiness infinite. What being, what circumstance can have the power to take it away from me? October 16, 1914. It is thy will that I should be like a channel, always open, always wider, through which thy forces may pour themselves in abundance on the world. O Lord, let thy will be done. Am I not thy will and thy consciousness in a felicity supreme? The being grows immeasurably in largeness and becomes vast like the universe. October 17, 1914. O Mother Divine, the obstacles shall be overcome, the enemies appeased, thou shalt dominate the whole earth with thy sovereign love, and every consciousness shall be illumined with thy serenity. This is the promise. October 23, 1914. O Lord, the entire being is ready and it calls thee to take possession of what is thine. Of what service can be the instrument if the Master will not use it? And whatever be the mode of manifestation, it shall be well, from the most humble, most obscure, most material, most outwardly limited, to the vastest, most brilliant, most powerful, most intellectual. The entire being is ready and waits in a passive silence until it is thy will to manifest. October 25, 1914. My aspiration to thee, O Lord, has taken the form of a beautiful rose, harmonious, full in bloom, rich in fragrance. I stretch it out to thee with both arms in a gesture of offering, and I ask of thee, if my understanding is limited, widen it; if my knowledge is obscure, enlighten it; if my heart is empty of ardor, set it aflame; if my love is insignificant, make it intense; if my feelings are ignorant and egoistic, give them the full consciousness in the truth. And though I which demands this of thee, O Lord, is not a little personality lost amidst thousands of others. It is the whole earth that aspires to thee in a movement full of fervor. In the perfect silence of my contemplation all widens to infinity, and in the perfect peace of that silence thou appearest in the resplendent glory of thy light. November 3, 1914. For quite a long time, Lord, my pen had fallen silent. Yet hast thou given me hours of unforgettable illumination, hours in which the union between the most divine consciousness and the most material grew perfect, hours when the identification of the individual being with the Universal Mother and of the Universal Mother with thee was so complete that the individual consciousness could perceive simultaneously its own existence, the life of the entire universe and thy eternity beyond all change. Beatitude was at its height in an ineffable and infinite peace, the consciousness luminous and immeasurable, complex and yet one, existence all-powerful, master of death. And this is no longer a fleeting state, attained after a long concentration, vanishing as soon as it is born. It is a state that can last long hours full of eternity, hours at once instantaneous and interminable, a state brought about at will, that is to say, one which is permanent, one with which the most external consciousness comes into contact as soon as any occasion allows it, as soon as it is no longer occupied with a definite intellectual or physical task. In all work, constantly, there is the perception of thy invariable presence in thy dual form of non-being and being, but as though behind a fine veil woven by the indispensable concentration upon the work that is done, while in the hours of solitude the being is immediately enveloped by a marvelously powerful atmosphere, limpid, calm, divine, it lies merged within it, and then the life of splendor begins again in all its amplitude, all its complexity, all its sublimity. The physical body is glorified, supple, vigorous, energetic, the mind is superbly active in its calm lucidity, guiding and transmitting the forces of thy divine will, and all the being exults in an endless beatitude, a boundless love, a sovereign power, a perfect knowledge, an infinite consciousness. It is thyself and thou alone who livest, even in the least atom of the body substance itself. Thus the solid foundations of thy terrestrial work are prepared, the substructure of the immense edifice built, in every corner of the world one of thy divine stones is laid by the power of conscious and formative thought, and in the hour of realizations the earth, thus prepared, will be ready to receive the sublime temple of thy new and more complete manifestation. November 8, 1914. For the plenitude of thy light we invoke thee, O Lord. Awaken in us the power to express thee. All is mute in the being as in a desert crypt, but in the heart of the shadow, in the bosom of the silence burns the lamp that can never be extinguished, the fire of an ardent aspiration to know thee and totally to live thee. The nights follow the days, new dawns unweariedly succeed to past dawns, but always there mounts the scented flame that no storm wind can force to vacillate. Higher it climbs and higher, and one day attains the vault still closed, the last obstacle opposing our union. And so pure, so erect, so proud is the flame that suddenly the obstacle is dissolved. Then thou appearest in all thy splendor, in the dazzling force of thy infinite glory. At thy contact the flame changes into a column of light that chases the shadows away forever. And the word leaps forth, a supreme revelation. November 9, 1914. O Lord, for perfect consciousness we aspire. All the being is gathered into a well-tied sheaf made of various but harmonized flowers. The wool was the hand that gathered the flowers and the tie that bound the sheaf, and it is the wool that now holds it out to thee like a scented offering. To thee it is held out unweariedly, without faltering. November 10, 1914. O Lord, thy presence is settled within me like an unshakable rock, and the whole being exults in belonging to thee without the least reserve, with a wide and complete surrender. O consciousness, immobile and serene, thou watchest at the confines of the world like the Sphinx of eternity. And yet to some thou yieldest thy secret. They can become thy sovereign will which chooses without preference, executes without desire. November 15, 1914. One important thing is the goal to be reached, the road matters little, and often it is preferable not to know it beforehand. But what we need to know is whether the time for the divine action upon earth has really come, and whether the work conceived in the depths can be realized. Of this, O Lord, thou hast given us the assurance, an assurance which has been accompanied by the most powerful promise that nature, the universal consciousness, can possibly make. Thus we have the certitude that what must be done will be done, and that our present individual beings are in reality called upon to collaborate in this glorious victory, this new manifestation. What more do we need to know? Nothing. So it is with the greatest confidence that we can witness the formidable fight, the onslaught of the adverse forces, which, unknowingly, finally serve in the realization of thy plan. We would be wrong to feel anxious because it is not given to us to know how it serves thy plan and by what means thou wilt triumph over all resistances, for thy triumph is so perfect that every obstacle, every ill will, every hatred raised up against thee is a promise of a still vaster and more complete victory. From the sum of resistances, one can gauge the scope thou wouldst give to the action of that among thy pure forces which is coming to manifest upon earth. What opposes is just that upon which it is the mission of these forces to act. It is the darkest hatred which must be touched and transformed into luminous peace. If the human individual thou hast chosen as thy center of action and thy intermediary meets with few obstacles, few misunderstandings and little hatred, it means that thou hast entrusted to him a limited mission without any intensity. It is in the narrow circle of already prepared men of goodwill that he will act, and not upon the chaotic and confused mass of terrestrial substance. O Divine Master, this knowledge which thou hast given me, let all of us share, so that the peace of conviction may reign in our hearts and we may, in the calm of thy sovereign certitude, confront with head held high all that, unconsciously attracted to the transfiguration, plunges headlong into blind ignorance, believing it will be able to destroy the transfiguring love. November 16, 1914. Teacher, you art like the wind upon the sea, driving the boat back ashore until it is at last loaded with all the goods necessary for the long voyage. Thou wouldst not have us embark thoughtlessly. Thy servitors must be ready for all eventualities, must be capable of answering all demands, satisfying all needs. November 17, 1914. Alas, sublime Mother, how great must be thy patience! Each time thy conscience will attempt to manifest itself in order to rectify errors, to hasten the uncertain progress of the individual led astray by his own illusion of knowledge, to trace the sure path and give him the strength to walk steadily upon it without stumbling. Almost always he pushes thee away as a tiresome and short-sighted adviser. He is willing to love thee in theory with a vague and inconsistent love, but his proud mind refuses to confide in thee and prefers to wander all by itself rather than advance guided by thee. And thou repliest, ever smiling in thy unwearying benevolence, this intellectual faculty which makes man proud and leads him into error is the very same which, once enlightened and purified, can also lead him farther, higher than universal nature, to a direct and conscious communion with our Lord, with that which is beyond all manifestation. This dividing intellect, which makes him stand apart from me, also enables him to scale rapidly the heights he must climb, without letting his progress be enchained and delayed by the totality of the universe, which, in its immensity and complexity, cannot effect so swift an ascent. O Divine Mother, always thy word comforts and blesses, calms and illumines, and thy generous hand lifts a fold of the veil hiding the infinite knowledge. How calm, noble and pure is the splendor of thy perfect contemplation. November 20th, 1914. I would be before thee, Lord, always like an absolutely blank page, so that thy will may be written in me without any difficulty, any mixture. The very remembrance of past experiences should sometimes be swept away from the thought so as not to obstruct this work of perpetual reconstruction which alone in a world of relativities permits thy perfect manifestation. Often one clings to that which was, fearing to lose the result of a precious experience, to give up a vast and high consciousness, to fall back into a lower state. And yet, what should he fear who is thine? Can he not walk with joyful soul and illumined brow upon the path thou tracest for him, whatever it may be, even if this path be altogether incomprehensible to his limited reason? O Lord, break the old frames of thought, abolish past experiences, dissolve the conscious synthesis if thou thinkest it necessary, so that thy work may be accomplished better and better, thy service upon earth be perfected. November 21st, 1914. O Lord, thou hast given me thy power that thy peace and joy may reign over the world. And this being is now only an embrace of peace enveloping the whole earth, an ocean of joy breaking over all things. O you who are full of hatred, rancor shall be effaced from your hearts as the sea effaces an imprint upon the sands. O you who feed upon vengeance, peace shall pass into your hearts as it enters the soul of a child rocked by its mother. For the divine and universal mother has turned her gaze upon the earth and she has blessed it. December 4th, 1914. After long days of silence, entirely occupied by outer work, it is at last given to me to resume these pages and continue with thee, Lord, this conversation which is so sweet to me. But thou hast broken all my habits, for thou wouldst prepare me for liberation from every mental form. Certain mental forms, more particularly powerful or adapted to the temperament, are sure guides to supreme experiences. But once the experiences are over, thou wouldst have them free in themselves from bondage to any mental form, however high or pure it may be, so as to be capable of expression in the new, most true form, that is, the one most suitable to the experience. So thou didst break all my forms of thought, and I found myself before thee stripped of all mental constructions, as ignorant about this as a newborn child, and in the darkness of this void lay once again the sovereign peace of something which is not expressed in words but which is. And I wait without impatience and without fear, for thee to construct once again from the heart of the unfathomable depths the intellectual form which seems to thee the most suitable for manifesting thee in this instrument moulded out of surrender and ardent faith. And before this immense night full of promise, I feel, more than I have ever felt before, free and vast, infinitely. And in a supreme beatitude I offer thee thanks, O Lord, for the marvelous favor thou hast bestowed upon me, that of being before thee like a newborn child. December 10th, 1914. Listen, O Lord, in the silence of deep meditation my prayer rises ardently to thee. Is it not a great folly to become identified with one form of thought, one mental construction, however vast and powerful it may be, to the point of making it the living center of one's being, one's experience and activity. Truth is eternally beyond all that we can think or say of it. To endeavor to find the most suitable expression, the one best adapted to this truth, is of course a useful task, even an indispensable one for the integrality of one's own development and that of all humanity, but one must always feel free in front of this expression, have one's center of consciousness above it, in the reality which, despite the grandeur, the beauty, the perfection of a mental formula, always eludes every formula. The world is not what we think it to be. The importance of the idea we have of it lies in its effect on our attitude towards action, and this attitude may come from a much deeper, truer, more unchanging inspiration than that resulting from a mental construction, however powerful it may be. To feel in oneself the will to express for men the eternal truth in a completer, higher, more exact form than all those which have preceded it, is good, but on condition that one does not identify oneself with this work to the point of being its slave and losing before it all independence and self-control. It is just an activity and nothing more, whatever may be its importance from the earthly point of view, but it must not be forgotten that it is relative like all activities and that we should not allow it to disturb our deep peace and that immutable calm which alone lets the divine forces manifest through us without any deformation. O Lord, my prayer is not formulated, but Thou hearest it. December 12, 1914. We must know at each moment how to lose everything that we may gain everything. We must be able to shed the past like a dead body that we may be reborn into a greater plenitude. It is so that the constant aspiration of the inner being expresses itself, turned to Thee, it wants to reflect Thee in an ever purer mirror, and Thy unchanging beatitude is translated in it into a propelling force of progress of an incomparable intensity, and this force is transformed in the most external being into a calm and assured will which no obstacle can vanquish. O Divine Master, with what an ardent love I serve Thee! With what a pure, still and infinite joy I am Thyself in all that is and beyond all existence in form. And the two consciousnesses unite in an unequalled plenitude. December 15, 1914. O Lord, Thou hast given me peace in power, serenity in action, immutable happiness in the heart of all circumstances. December 22, 1914. It is for the truth, O Lord, that I implore Thee. Once again make active this mind which fell mute in order to surrender to Thee, give it the knowledge of Thy will. It welcomed and allowed all possibilities to take form in it, then in order to stop the conflict of their contrary tendencies, it closed the door to these unwelcome visitors, saying, I don't need to live actively, to know what Thy will is, Lord, provided that I can transmit the ray of Thy eternal light without distorting it. So it was done and the will became submissive, one-pointed, precise and strong. But now Thou wouldst have the mind know, and Thou hast said to it, awake and become aware of the truth. Then the mind has answered with joy, and now it turns to the resplendent Sun of sovereign truth, calling it to itself in order to manifest it. Thou wouldst break down all barriers, one after another, that the being may take on the integral amplitude of all its possibilities of manifestation. Let all earthly desires come together in me, O Lord, so that Thou mayst consider them, and Thou will be able to work precisely, clearly, definitively upon the smallest detail as upon the whole. Thus the advent of the awaited time will be hastened. All the being exults in intense joy and unequalled plenitude. January 2, 1915. Every idea, however powerful and profound it may be, repeated too often, expressed too constantly, becomes stale, insipid, worthless. The highest concepts thus lose their freshness after a time, and the intelligence which delighted in transcendental speculations suddenly feels an imperious need to abandon all reasonings and all its philosophy and contemplate life with the marveling gaze of a child, so as no longer to remember anything of its past knowledge, were it even a sovereignly divine one. It is true to say that the divisions of time are purely arbitrary, that the date assigned to the renewal of the year varies according to the latitude, the climate, the customs, and that it is purely conventional. This is the mental attitude which smiles at the childishness of men and wants to let itself be guided by profounder truths. And then suddenly the mind itself feels its powerlessness to translate these truths precisely, and, renouncing all wisdom of this kind, it lets the song of the aspiring heart arise, the heart for which every circumstance is an opportunity for a deeper, vaster and more intense aspiration. The year of the West renews itself. Why not profit by it to will with renewed ardor that this symbol should become a reality and the deplorable things of the past give place to things which must exist in all glory? Always we believe that we can define thee, can shut thee up in our mental formulas, but however vast, complex, synthetic they may be, thou wilt remain always the inexpressible even for him who knows and lives thee. For one can live thee though one is unable to express thee, can be thy infinity and realize it though unable to define or explain thee. Always thou wilt remain the eternal mystery, worthy of all our wonder, not only in thy unthinkable and even unknowable transcendence but in thy universal manifestation, in all that we integrally are. And always forms of thought are succeeded by new forms, ever purer, higher and more comprehensive, but never will one of them be considered sufficient to give so much as an idea of what thou art. And each new fact will be a new problem, more marvelous and mysterious than all that preceded it. Yet, faced with its own ignorance and incapacity, the mental being remains luminous, smiling and calm, even as though it possessed the supreme knowledge, that of its being thou, innumerably, invariably, infinitely, very simply thou. January 11, 1915. More than ever before, the aspiration of the mental being rose to thee with great fervor. The perception of infinity and eternity is always there. But it is as if thou hadst willed to cut me off from all religious joy, all spiritual ecstasy, in order to plunge me into the most strictly material circumstances. Everywhere, O Lord, is thy perfect bliss, and nothing can take away from me that grand gift thou hast made of it to me. In every place and every circumstance it is with me, it is myself as I am thou. But all this is nothing beside what should be. Thou wantest that from the heart of this heavy and obscure matter I make the volcano of thy love and light burst forth. Thou wantest that breaking all the old conventions of language there may arise a word fit to express thee, a word never heard before. Thou wouldst that the union between the smallest things below and the vastest, sublimest things above might become integral, and that is why, O Lord, cutting me off from all religious joy and all spiritual ecstasy, depriving me of all freedom to concentrate exclusively upon thee, thou saidst to me, work like an ordinary man in the midst of ordinary people, learn to be nothing more than they in everything that manifests, participate in all their ways of life, for beyond all that they know, all that they are, thou carriest within thee the torch of the eternal splendor which does not flicker, and by associating with them this is what thou wilt bring in their midst. Dost thou need to enjoy this light, so long as it radiates to all from thee? Is it necessary for thee to feel my love vibrating in thee, so long as thou givest it? Must thou taste fully the bliss of my presence, so long as thou canst serve as its intermediary to all? May thy will be done, O Lord, done integrally. It is my happiness and my law. January 17, 1915. Now, Lord, things have changed. The time of rest and preparation is over. Thou hast willed that from the passive and contemplative servitor I become an active and realizing one. Thou hast willed that joyful acceptance be transformed into joyful battle, and that in a constant and heroic effort against everything which in the world opposes the accomplishment of thy law in its purest and highest present expression, I find again the same peaceful and unchanging poise which one keeps in a surrender to thy law as it is now being accomplished, that is, without entering into a direct struggle with all that opposes it, making the best of every circumstance and acting by contagion, example and slow infusion. In a partial and limited battle, but one that is representative of the great terrestrial struggle, thou dost put my strength, determination and courage to the test to see if I can truly be thy servitor. If the result of the battle shows that I am worthy of being the mediator of thy regenerating action, thou wilt extend the field of action. And if I always live up to what thou expectest of me, a day will come, O Lord, when thou wilt be upon earth, and the whole earth will rise against thee. But thou wilt take the earth in thy arms, and the earth will be transformed. January 18, 1915. Lord, hear my prayer. In me thou art all-powerful, sovereign master of my destiny, my life's guide, conqueror of all obstacles, victor over preconceived wills and mental prejudices. Perhaps to be all-powerful in the world outside, thou needest the instrumentation of my mind, organizer and shaper of the means of action. But if thou canst make the instrument perfect, how can there be any doubt that the work will be accomplished? All evil shadows which bring contrary suggestions must be driven away very far, and, with a complete and unshakable trust in thy infinite mercy, I address this prayer to thee. Transform thy enemies into friends, change the darkness into light. In this immense heroic struggle, in this sublime struggle of love against hatred, of justice against injustice, of obedience to thy supreme law against revolt, may I gradually be able to make humanity worthy of a still sublimer peace in which, all internal dissensions having ceased, the whole effort of man may be united for the attainment of a more and more perfect and integral realization of thy divine will and thy progressive ideal. January 24, 1915. Lord, I have long remained silent before thee in one of those inner prostrations full of an ardent adoration which culminate in a supreme identification. And, as always, thou saidst to me, turn thy look towards the earth. And I saw all the roads wide open and radiant with a calm and pure light. In mute adoration, filled utterly with thy will, I turned towards the earth. February 15, 1915. O Lord of truth, thrice have I implored thy manifestation, invoking thee with deep fervor. Then, as always, the whole being made its total submission. At that moment the consciousness perceived the individual being mental, vital and physical, covered all over with dust, and this being lay prostrate before thee, its forehead touching the earth, dust in the dust, and it cried to thee, O Lord, this being made of dust prostrates itself before thee, praying to be consumed with the fire of the truth, that it may henceforth manifest only thee. Then thou saidst to it, Arise, thou art pure of all that is dust. And suddenly, in a stroke, all the dust sank from it like a cloak that falls on the earth, and the being appeared erect, always as substantial but resplendent with a dazzling light. March 3, 1915. On board the Kamomaru. Solitude, a harsh, intense solitude, and always this strong impression of having been flung headlong into a hell of darkness. Never at any moment of my life, in any circumstances, have I felt myself living in surroundings so entirely opposite to all that I am conscious of as true, so contrary to all that is the essence of my life. Sometimes when the impression and the contrast grow very intense, I cannot prevent my total submission from taking on a hue of melancholy, and the calm and mute converse with the Master within is transformed for a moment into an invocation that almost supplicates, O Lord, what have I done that thou hast thrown me thus into the somber night? But immediately the aspiration rises, still more ardent, spare this being all weakness, suffer it to be the docile and clear-eyed instrument of thy work, whatever that work may be. For the moment the clear-sightedness is lacking, never was the future more veiled. It is as though we were moving towards a high, impenetrable wall, so far as the destiny of individual men is concerned. As for the destinies of nations and of the earth, they appear more distinctly. But of these it is useless to speak, the future will reveal them clearly to all eyes, even of the most blind. March 4, 1915. Always the same harsh solitude. But it is not painful, on the contrary. In it more clearly than ever, is revealed the pure and infinite love in which the whole earth is immersed. By this love all lives and is animated, the darkest shadows become almost translucent to let its streams flow through, and the intensest pain is transformed into potent bliss. Each turn of the propeller upon the deep ocean seems to drag me farther away from my true destiny, the one best expressing the divine will. Each passing hour seems to plunge me again deeper into that past with which I had broken. Sure of being called to new and vaster realizations, everything seems to draw me back to a state of things totally contrary to the life of my soul which reigns uncontested over outer activities, and, despite the apparent sadness of my own situation, the consciousness is so firmly established in a world which passes beyond personal limitations on every side, that the whole being rejoices in a constant perception of power and love. In the material actuality, tomorrow lies dark and unreadable. No light, not even the faintest, reveals to my bewildered gaze any indication, any presence of the divine. But something in the depths of consciousness turns to the invisible and sovereign witness and tells him, "Thou dost plunge me, O Lord, into the thickest darkness. This means that thou hast established thy light so firmly in me that thou knowest it will stand this perilous ordeal. Otherwise wouldst thou have chosen me for the descent into the vortex of this hell as thy torchbearer? Wouldst thou have judged my heart strong enough not to fail, my hand firm enough not to tremble? And yet my individual being knows how weak and powerless it is. When thou dost not manifest thy presence, it is more denuded than most people who do not know or care for thee. In thee alone lies its strength and ability. If thou art pleased to make use of it, nothing will be too difficult to accomplish, no task too vast and complex. But if thou shouldst withdraw, just a poor child is left, capable only of nestling in thy arms and sleeping there in the sweet dreamless sleep, where nothing else exists but thou." March 7, 1915. It is past, the time of sweet mental silence, so peaceful, so pure, through which could be felt the profound will expressing itself in its all-powerful truth. Now the will is no longer perceived, and the mind once more necessarily active, analyses, classifies, judges, chooses, constantly reacts as a transforming agent upon everything that is imposed on the individuality, grown wide enough to be in contact with a world infinitely vast and complex, a world of mingled light and shadow like all that belongs to the earth. I am exiled from every spiritual happiness, and of all ordeals this, O Lord, is surely the most painful that thou canst impose, but most of all the withdrawal of thy will, which seems to be a sign of total disapprobation. Strong is the growing sense of rejection, and it needs all the ardor of an untiring faith to keep the external consciousness thus abandoned to itself from being invaded by an irremediable sorrow. But it refuses to despair, it refuses to believe that the misfortune is irreparable. It waits with humility in an obscure and hidden effort and struggle for the breath of thy perfect joy to penetrate it again. And perhaps each of its modest and secret victories is a true help brought to the earth. If it were possible to come definitively out of this external consciousness, to take refuge in the divine consciousness. But that thou hast forbidden, and still and always thou forbidst it. No flight out of the world. The burden of its darkness and ugliness must be borne to the end, even if all divine succor seems to be withdrawn. I must remain in the bosom of the night and walk on without compass, without beacon light, without inner guide. I will not even implore thy mercy, for what thou willst for me, I too will. All my energy is intentioned solely to advance, always to advance step after step, despite the depth of the darkness, despite the obstacles of the way, and whatever comes, O Lord, it is with a fervent and unchanging love that thy decision will be welcomed. Even if thou findest the instrument unfit to serve thee, the instrument belongs to itself no more, it is thine, thou canst destroy or magnify it, it exists not in itself, it wills nothing, it can do nothing without thee. March 8, 1915. For the most part the condition is one of calm and profound indifference, the being feels neither desire nor repulsion, neither enthusiasm nor depression, neither joy nor sorrow. It regards life as a spectacle in which it takes only a very small part. It perceives its actions and reactions, conflicts and forces as things that at once belong to its own existence, which overflows the small personality on every side, and yet to that personality are altogether foreign and remote. But from time to time a great breath passes, a great breath of sorrow, of anguished isolation, of spiritual destitution, one might almost say, the despairing appeal of earth abandoned by the divine. It is a pang as silent as it is cruel, a sorrow submissive, without revolt, without any desire to avoid or pass out of it, and full of an infinite sweetness in which suffering and felicity are closely wedded, something infinitely vast, great and deep, too great, too deep perhaps to be understood by men, something that holds in it the seed of tomorrow. Lunel, April 19, 1915. An imperious need has forced me to return to this confidant of my seekings and the efforts of my soul. All external circumstances have changed, giving a flat lie to the dream of the ideal which sought expression even in material activities. The hour has not yet come for joyful realizations in outer physical things. The physical being is plunged once again into the dull, monotonous night from which it wanted to withdraw too hastily, and thy realized will, O Lord of Truth, has come to tell the constructing mind, you don't think this is true, and yet it is. The mind has readily recognized that it was mistaken and has surrendered completely to all that thou willest. The vital being is quiet and satisfied in all circumstances. All feeling dwells in an equal and pure peace, the whole being is flooded with thy vast, eternal light, thy love penetrates and animates it. And yet the impression that outer facts are fostered has not been effaced, and the body, despite its indisputable goodwill, is so profoundly shaken that it cannot manage to regain its equilibrium and health. The entire earthly life of this being, from its very beginning to the present moment, gives it the impression of an unreal dream, very remote from it, having almost no further contact with it. All this outer mechanism is now only a machine which it moves, for such is the will of its central reality. But it is no longer interested in it, perhaps sometimes even less than the neighboring mechanism or even the unknown mechanism that will be the product of the earth of tomorrow. But this earth itself is strange to it, and as it is not aware of anything else except the eternal silence, all life that has form appears remote and almost unreal to it. It seems strange to it that anyone could desire anything since it does not exist, or prefer one thing to another since neither is there. But at the same time it does not see why it should object to any action whatever it may be, since all actions are equally unreal, and it does not feel the necessity to flee from a world which does not exist and cannot be a burden, since its existence is so inexistent. All this gives the feeling of a sort of void full of light, peace, immensity, eluding all form and all definition. It is the naught, but a naught which is real and can last eternally, for it is, even while having the perfect immensity of that which is not. Poor words which tried to say what silence itself cannot express. The condition thus trying to define itself in awkward terms gradually settled in some weeks ago, and every passing day establishes it more definitively, more deeply, more irremediably so to speak. Without having wanted it, sought for it or desired it, the being sinks deeper and deeper into it, also gradually losing consciousness of itself in a consciousness which is no longer individual and whose immobility is inexpressible, a consciousness from which it is no longer possible to distinguish oneself. May 24, 1915. One day, O Lord, thou didst teach my mind that it could act fully as an instrument of manifestation of thy divine truth, as an intermediary of thy eternal will, without being limited in its realizing constructions by the narrow field of possibilities of the external being. Till then this mind, except very rarely, was in the habit of coming out of its mute ecstasy, its silent contemplation before thy ineffable infinity, only to concentrate its effort on the center of action represented by the external being, and this was a sort of bondage within too narrow a frame. There was a contradiction between the powers of mental realization and the instrument through which they were striving to make their way out. The most immediate result was the wastage and limitation of mental energies, which, not finding any satisfaction in activity, quite naturally returned to merge into thy eternity. Suddenly thou didst put an end to this disorder, thou didst liberate the mind from its last fetters, thou didst teach it to be freely active through all forms and no longer exclusively through those it considered till then as its own, that is, as its natural means of expression. The vital being had already realized this liberation long ago and knew how to enjoy the plenitude of sensations and emotions in all forms capable of manifesting life. But the mental being had not yet learnt how to animate, organize and illuminate consciously all lives without distinction. Thou didst break down all barriers, thou didst open to it the doors of thy infinite manifestation. Within a few days the new conquest was established, affirmed. And what thou expectest from the center of consciousness represented at present upon earth by my whole being, grew clear before it, to be the life in all material forms, the thought organizing and using this life in all forms, the love widening, enlightening, intensifying, uniting all the varied elements of this thought, and thus, through a total identification with the manifested world, to be able to intervene with full power in its transformations. On the other hand, by a perfect surrender to the supreme principle, to become aware of the truth and the eternal will that manifests it. Through this identification, having become the faithful servant and sure intermediary of the divine will, and uniting this conscious identification with the principle to the conscious identification with its becoming, to mold and model consciously the love, mind and life of the becoming in accordance with the law of truth of the principle. This is how the individual being can be the conscious mediator between the absolute truth and the manifested universe and intervene in the slow, uncertain march of the yoga of nature in order to give it the swiftness, intensity and sureness of the divine yoga. This is how in certain periods the entire terrestrial life seems to cross miraculously over stages which at other times would require thousands of years to traverse. At present, O Lord, the state of perfect and conscious surrender to thy eternal will is, as far as I can tell, constant, invariable behind every act, every movement of the mind, the vital or the body. This imperturbable calm, this deep, peaceful, unchanging bliss, which never leave me. Are they not a proof of this? Passive or receptive identification with life, thought and love in all manifested forms is an accomplished fact, apparently the inevitable consequence of surrender to pure truth. But the moments when consciousness becomes effectively the life animating and molding all material forms, the intelligence organizing life, and the love illuminating the intelligence, in an active and fully conscious way, at once in the totality and the least detail, with a sense of infinite plenitude and precise powers, these moments are still intermittent though growing more and more frequent and lasting. It is in these moments that the two consciousnesses are simultaneous and fuse into a single, almost indescribable, ineffable consciousness in which are united immutable eternity and eternal movement. It is in these moments that the present work begins to be accomplished. Marcelages, July 31, 1915. Should I, playing the role of a servant, an instrument, turn to thee, O Lord, and address a hymn of adoration to thee? Should I, identifying myself with thee in the eternal reality and infinite bliss, speak to men of the peace and joy they do not know? The two attitudes are simultaneous, the two consciousnesses parallel, and in this close and indissoluble union lies plenitude. The heavens are definitively conquered, and nothing and nobody could have the power of wresting them from me. But the conquest of the earth is still to be made, it is being carried on in the very heart of the turmoil, and even when achieved, it will still be only a relative one. The victories in this world are but stages leading progressively to still more glorious victories, and what thou will makes my mind conceive of as the goal to be attained, the conquest to be realized, is only one element of thy eternal plan, but in perfect union I am this plan and this will, and I taste the supreme bliss of the infinite, even while playing ardently, with precision and energy, in the world of division, the special part thou hast entrusted to me. Thy power in me is like a living spring, strong and abundant, rumbling behind the rocks, gathering its energies to break down the obstacles and gush out freely in the open, pouring its waters over the plain to fertilize it. When will the hour of this emergence come? When the moment arrives, it will burst forth, and time is nothing in eternity. But what words can describe the immensity of joy brought by this inner accumulation, this deep concentration, of all the forces that are submissive to the manifestation of thy will of tomorrow, preparing to break over the world, drowning in their sovereign flood all that still persists in wanting to be the expression of thy will of yesterday, so as to take possession of the earth in thy name and offer it to thee as a completer image of thyself. Thou hast said that the earth would die, and it will die to its old ignorance. Thou hast said that the earth would live, and it will live in the renewal of thy power. What words will ever tell the splendor of thy law and the magnificence of thy glory? What words will express the perfection of thy consciousness and the infinite bliss of thy love? What words will sing thy ineffable peace and celebrate the majesty of thy silence and the grandeur of thy all-powerful truth? The entire manifested universe cannot suffice to speak thy splendor and tell thy marvels, and in the eternity of time this is what it is trying to do more and more, better and better, eternally. Paris, November 2, 1915. After a few moments spent in arranging familiar objects, as a strong breeze passes over the sea and crowns with foam its countless waves, so a great breath passed over the memory and awoke the multitude of its remembrances. Intense, complex, crowded, the past lived again in a flash, having lost nothing of its savor, its richness. Then was the whole being lifted up in a great surge of adoration, and gathering all its memories like an abundant harvest, it placed them at thy feet, O Lord, as an offering. For throughout its life, without knowing it or with some presentiment of it, it was thou whom it was seeking, in all its passions, all its enthusiasms, all its hopes and disillusionments, all its sufferings and all its joys, it was thou whom it ardently wanted. And now that it has found thee, now that it possesses thee in a supreme peace and felicity, it wonders that it should have needed so many sensations, emotions, experiences to discover thee. But all this, which was a struggle, a turmoil, a perpetual effort, has become through the sovereign grace of thy conscious presence, a priceless fortune which the being rejoices to offer as its gift to thee. The purifying flame of thy illumination has turned it into jewels of price laid down as a living holocaust on the altar of my heart. Errors have become stepping stones, the blind gropings conquests. Thy glory transforms defeats into victories of eternity, and all the shadows have fled before thy radiant light. It is thou who art the motive and the goal, thou art the worker and the work. The personal existence is a canticle, perpetually renewed, which the universe offers up to thy inconceivable splendor. November 7, 1915. 3 a.m. Without any external sign, any special circumstance, the moments passed by so majestically, in so solemn an inner silence, a calm so deep and vast, that my tears began to flow profusely. For the last 2 days the earth seems to have been going through a decisive crisis. It seems that the great formidable contest between material resistances and spiritual powers is nearing its conclusion, or, in any case, that some element of capital importance has made or is going to make its appearance in the play. How little do individual beings count at such times? They are like wisps of straw carried away by the passing breeze, whirling for a moment above the ground, only to be flung back upon it again and reduced to dust. And individual beings who thus feel so insecure, so stripped of importance, suffer and groan in painful agony. For them the waiting itself is a perpetual menace, everything speaks of danger and destruction. But what grandeur, what sovereign beauty lie in the depth of this outer anguish all formed of narrow egoism, what splendor dwells within this waiting, grown sacred through deep contemplation, when the walls of personal blindness have fallen and the individual consciousness has taken its flight into immensity to unite with thy eternal consciousness. This sorrowful world kneels before thee, O Lord, in mute supplication. Matter, tortured, takes shelter at thy feet, its last and only refuge, and imploring thee thus, it adores thee, thee whom it neither knows nor understands. Its prayer rises like the cry of one in a last agony. What is disappearing feels vaguely the possibility of living once again in thee. The earth awaits thy decree in a grandiose prostration. Listen, listen, its voice implores and supplicates to thee. What will be thy decree? What is thy sentence? O Lord of truth, this individual world blesses thy truth which it does not yet know, but which it calls, and to which it adheres with all the joyful energy of its living forces. Death has passed, vast and solemn, and all was hushed in a religious silence while it was passing by. A superhuman beauty has appeared upon earth. Something more marvelous than the most marvelous bliss has brought a foretaste of its presence. November 26, 1915. The entire consciousness immersed in divine contemplation, the whole being enjoyed a supreme and vast felicity. Then was the physical body seized, first in its lower members and next the whole of it, by a sacred trembling which made all personal limits fall away little by little even in the most material sensation. The being grew in greatness progressively, methodically, breaking down every barrier, shattering every obstacle, that it might contain and manifest a force and a power which increased ceaselessly in immensity and intensity. It was as a progressive dilatation of the cells until there was a complete identification with the earth. The body of the awakened consciousness was the terrestrial globe moving harmoniously in ethereal space. And the consciousness knew that its global body was thus moving in the arms of the universal being, and it gave itself, it abandoned itself to it in an ecstasy of peaceful bliss. Then it felt that its body was absorbed in the body of the universe and one with it. The consciousness became the consciousness of the universe, immobile in its totality, moving infinitely in its internal complexity. The consciousness of the universe sprang towards the divine in an ardent aspiration, a perfect surrender, and it saw in the splendor of the immaculate light the radiant being standing on a many-headed serpent whose body coiled infinitely around the universe. The being in an eternal gesture of triumph mastered and created at one and the same time the serpent and the universe that issued from him. Erect on the serpent he dominated it with all his victorious might, and the same gesture that crushed the hydra enveloping the universe gave it eternal birth. Then the consciousness became this being and perceived that its form was changing once more. It was absorbed into something which was no longer a form and yet contained all forms, something which, immutable, sees, the eye, the witness. And what it sees, is. Then this last vestige of form disappeared and the consciousness itself was absorbed into the unutterable, the ineffable. The return towards the consciousness of the individual body took place very slowly in a constant and invariable splendor of light and power and felicity and adoration, by successive gradations, but directly, without passing again through the universal and terrestrial forms. And it was as if the modest corporeal form had become the direct and immediate vesture, without any intermediary, of the supreme and eternal witness. 1. This is a letter which the mother sent to Sri Aurobindo and to which he answered on the 31st of December 1915 as follows. The experience you have described is Vedic in the real sense, though not one which would easily be recognized by the modern systems of yoga which call themselves Vedic. It is the union of the earth of the Veda and Purana with the divine principle, an earth which is said to be above our earth, that is to say, the physical being and consciousness of which the world and the body are only images. But the modern yogas hardly recognize the possibility of a material union with the divine. January 15, 1916. O teacher, you whom I may call my God, thou who art the personal form of the transcendent eternal, the cause, source and reality of my individual being, thou who hast through the centuries and millenniums slowly and subtly kneaded this matter, so that one day it could become consciously identified with thee, and be nothing but thee, O thou who hast appeared to me in all thy divine splendor. This individual being in all its complexity offers itself to thee in an act of supreme adoration. It aspires in its entirety to be identified with thee, to be thyself, eternally thou, merged forever in thy reality. But is it ready for that? Is thy work fully accomplished? Is there in it no longer any shadow, ignorance, or limitation? Canst thou at last definitively take possession of it and, in the sublimest, most integral transformation, free it forever from the world of ignorance and make it live in the world of truth? Or rather thou art myself divested of all error and limitation. Have I become integrally this true self in all the atoms of my being? Wilt thou bring about an overwhelming transformation, or will it still be a slow action in which cell after cell must be wrested from its darkness and its limits? Thou art the sovereign, ready to take possession of thy kingdom, Dost thou not find thy kingdom yet ready enough for thee to link it definitively to thyself and become integrated with it? Will the great miracle of the integral divine life in the individual at last be accomplished? January 22, 1916. Teacher, you has taken entire possession of this miserable instrument, and if it is not yet perfected enough for thee to complete its transformation, its transmutation, thou art at work in each one of its cells to knead it and make it supple and enlighten it, and in the whole being, to arrange, organize and harmonize it. Everything is in movement, everything is changing. Thy divine action makes itself felt as an ineffable spring of a purifying fire that circulates through all the atoms. And this flowing spring has brought into the being an ecstasy more marvelous than any it had ever felt before. Thus to thy action there answers the aspiration of that on which thou workest, and the aspiration is all the more ardent because the instrument has seen itself as it really is in all its infirmity. O Lord, I implore thee, hasten the blessed day when the divine miracle will be accomplished, hasten the day of the realization of the divine upon earth. January 23, 1916. O Teacher, you divine inhabitant of this grace form, thou sayest that it is a mass of limitations. Wilt thou not break all these limitations so that it may participate in thy infinity? Thou sayest that it is full of obscurities. Wilt thou not dissolve this darkness with thy resplendent light so that it may participate in thy brightness? Thou sayest it burdened with ignorant impurities. Wilt thou not consume all these impurities with thy devouring fire of love, so that the being in its integrality may now become one in all consciousness with thee? Dost thou not find that this somber and sorrowful experience of egoistic separativity has lasted long enough for the earth and humanity? Has not the hour struck in the universe for this phase of development to be replaced by another, dominated by the pure and vast consciousness of thy unity? Unceasingly, at every moment, my invocation rises to thee, and I call thee, Lord, O Lord, take possession of thy kingdom, illumine it with thy eternal presence, put an end to the cruel error in which it lives believing itself separate from thee, while in its reality and essence it is thyself. Break down the last resistances, consume the last impurities, blast this being if need be, but let it be transfigured. Tokyo, June 7, 1916. Long months have gone by in which nothing could be said, for it was a period of transition, of passing from one equilibrium to another, vaster and more complete. The outer circumstances were manifold and new, as if the being needed to accumulate many perceptions and observations in order to give a more extensive and complex base to its experience. But, being entirely plunged within this experience, it did not have the necessary perspective to see it as a whole, to know what it was and above all where it was leading. Suddenly, on the 5th of June the veil was rent, and there was light in my consciousness. When I contemplated thee in thy individual form, O Lord of eternity, and implored thee to take possession of thy kingdom of the flesh, thou didst set again into motion, into activity this vital form, which, for the necessity of development and unification, had been living for years in a passivity that was receptive and harmonious but alien to all active manifestation of thy will. This return to activity meant a completely new adaptation of the vital instrument, for its natural tendency is always to resume action with its old habits and methods. This period of adaptation was long, painful, sometimes obscure, though behind, the perception of thy presence and perfect surrender to thy law were immutable and quite strongly conscious for any disturbance to shake the being. Gradually the vital being grew accustomed to find harmony in the intensest action as it had in passive surrender. And once this harmony was sufficiently established, there was light again in all the parts of the being, and the consciousness of what had happened became complete. Now in the heart of action the vital being has discovered the perception of infinity and eternity. It can perceive thy supreme beauty and live it in all sensations and all forms. Even in its every sensation, extended, active, fully developed to feel contrary sensations at the same time, always it perceives thee. It is not unaware, however, that this is only one stage, and it bows before thee in a profound adoration and tells thee, Lord, thou hast taken up thy instrument again and willed to use it for action. The instrument knows its imperfection and impurity and implores thy mercy to perfect and purify it, so that, day by day, through a progressive disappearance of all its preferences and limitations, it may be able to manifest thee more integrally. November 28, 1916. Teacher, you madest me read these childish babblings once again, for they are awkward attempts at expression of a mind still in its infancy, and all this seemed to me far, very remote, clad in the charm and purity of the experiences of a candid and enthusiastic childhood. And yet, before thee, O eternal Lord, I have not grown any older and have not made any progress. The expression of today will not be better than that of those early days. The mind is still as poor and clumsy as before. And what could it have to express that is so remarkable? No sensational experience, all experiences now seem simple and natural. No powerful or exceptional new idea, none of those ideas which fill one with the joy of discovery. All ideas, whatever form they may take, now seem like old acquaintances one greets amicably in passing, but from whom one expects nothing new. No scrupulous and detailed psychological analysis, exposing some yet unexplored inner recess, internal complications no longer exist in themselves, they are faithful and impartial reflections of all the surrounding psychological movements, and to describe what is going on in the being would be at once as complicated and monotonous as to describe the world in its almost exclusively subconscious gropings and wanderings. Poverty, poverty. Thou hast placed me in an arid and bare desert, and yet this desert is sweet to me as everything that comes from thee, O Lord. In this dull and wan greyness, in this dim ashen light, I taste the savour of the infinite spaces, the pure breeze of the open seas. The powerful breath of the free heights constantly fill my heart and penetrate my life. All barriers have fallen, within and around me, and I feel like a bird opening its wings for an unrestrained flight. But the bird remains perched upon a rock, its wings outspread against the grey, fleecy sky, awaiting, in order to soar upwards, the coming of something it expects without knowing what it is. As it no longer has any chains to check its flight, it no longer dreams of flying away. Conscious of its freedom, it does not enjoy it, and remains like the others, among the others, perched on the ground in the midst of the dark and dense fog. December 4, 1916. Since thou hast permitted it, O Lord, I have once again begun to come to thee daily, freeing myself for a few brief moments from an activity of which I know the complete relativity, even while I am engaged in it. Thou hadst plunged me back into action and the ordinary consciousness, and now thou grantest me the possibility of regularly taking my flight again to thee, to soar a while in the immutable silence and eternal consciousness. Thou hast willed, O Lord, that the being should grow wider and richer. It could not do so without entering once again, at least partially and temporarily, into ignorance and obscurity. This ignorance and obscurity it comes now to lay at thy feet as the most humble of ordeals. I shall not ask thee to bestow upon me continuously the consciousness thou grantest me in these moments of peaceful and pure communion. I shall ask thee only to make these moments still more peaceful and pure, to fortify and enlighten the consciousness more and more, so that it may return to its daily task with renewed strength and knowledge. Thou remindest me through these brief moments of ecstatic identification that thou hast granted me the power of consciously uniting with thee. And the divine musical harmony captures the entire being. But the sounds gather in the head as behind a veil, and not a word flows from the pen today. December 5, 1916. Teacher, you hast granted me the grace of thy repose, in which all individual limits are dissolved, in which one is in all and, more clearly still, all is in oneself. But the mind, merged in this divine ecstasy, cannot yet find any power of expression. Factual notation of the experience. Turn towards the earth. The usual injunction was heard in the silence of the immutable identification. Then the consciousness became that of the one in all. Everywhere and in all those in whom thou canst see the one, there will awake the consciousness of this identity with the divine. Look. It was a Japanese street brilliantly illuminated by gay lanterns picturesquely adorned with vivid colors. And as gradually what was conscious moved on down the street, the divine appeared, visible in everyone and everything. One of the lightly built houses became transparent, revealing a woman seated on a tatami in a sumptuous violet kimono embroidered with gold and bright colors. The woman was beautiful and must have been between 35 and 40. She was playing a golden samisen. At her feet lay a little child. And in the woman too the divine was visible.